the monster beside the throne. The Hall of Ascension existed to intimidate. Massive black pillars stretched into darkness high above the imperial court, while molten rivers of gold glowed behind crystal walls, bathing the chamber in flickering amber light. Hundreds of nobles from across the Varexian Empire filled the floating Senate platforms arranged around the throne. But no one truly watched Emperor Kaelor. Their attention stayed fixed on the human standing beside him. Captain Elias Ward stood in absolute silence near the imperial throne, his broad frame wrapped in matte black combat armor marked by old plasma burns and knife scars. Unlike the ceremonial guards surrounding the chamber, he wore no decorative cape or jeweled insignia. A heavy railgun pistol rested against his thigh beside a long combat blade. He looked less like a royal protector and more like a survivor of endless wars. The nobles hated him for it. Humans were tolerated only in the Empire's outer systems. They served as miners, smugglers, laborers, and mercenaries, useful but uncivilized. To the aristocracy, humanity was a species born from chaos, aggressive, emotional, and impossible to fully control. Allowing a human inside the palace already offended tradition. Making one the Emperor's personal bodyguard bordered on madness. Lord Vethrin finally rose from his platform, silver robes flowing behind his tall, skeletal frame. "This disgrace has endured long enough," he declared. The chamber fell silent. Vethrin pointed toward Elias with one clawed hand. "A primitive predator stands beside the ruler of our empire while noble bloodlines are ignored. Every ancient law of the court is being insulted." Several senators murmured in agreement. Elias did not react. That unnerved them even more. Most beings defended themselves when insulted. Elias simply watched the room with cold, unreadable eyes, as if measuring threats instead of listening to words. Emperor Kaelor leaned back slightly on his dark throne. "You object to Captain Ward's presence?" he asked calmly. "I object to what he represents," Vethrin answered. "Humans possess no discipline, no honor. They survive through violence and instinct." Kaelor glanced briefly toward Elias before returning his attention to the court. "And yet," the Emperor said softly, "he has saved my life repeatedly, while many nobles here plotted against it." The room stiffened. Vethrin's expression darkened. "You would place your trust in a human over your own people?" "Yes." The answer struck the chamber like a weapon. Whispers spread immediately across the Senate platforms. Vethrin stepped forward boldly. "Then the court formally demands the removal of the human from your side." For the first time, Elias moved. He simply lifted his gaze toward Vethrin. Nothing else. No threat. No anger. But the noble instinctively stopped speaking. Stories about Elias Ward had spread across the Empire for years. Pirate fleets destroyed along frontier routes. Assassins disappearing before reaching the palace. Entire insurgent groups found dead without explanation. No one knew how many stories were true. That uncertainty terrified them. Kaelor slowly rose from the throne. "The day Elias Ward leaves my side," he said quietly, "is the day this empire dies." Silence crushed the hall. Even Vethrin had no answer. The Emperor turned and walked from the chamber, ending the session immediately. Elias followed close behind as nobles whispered nervously in their wake. The palace corridors beyond the throne room were quieter, lined with glowing crystal walls that reflected the distant lights of the capital city below. "You frightened them again," Kaelor said lightly. "They were already frightened," Elias replied. A faint smile crossed the Emperor's face. That was another reason the court distrusted the human. Elias spoke little, but when he did, his words carried unsettling certainty. Kaelor slowed his pace slightly. Vethrin grows more desperate. He's not the dangerous one. The Emperor glanced sideways. "No." 3 military delegates supported him without speaking. 2 senators avoided eye contact when the vote started. "Something's moving behind the court." Kaelor sighed quietly. "You notice too much. It keeps you alive." Before the Emperor could respond, the palace lights suddenly died. Darkness swallowed the corridor. An alarm shrieked through the walls as gravity systems failed. Servants and guards lifted helplessly into the air. Elias reacted instantly. Down! He grabbed the Emperor and forced him behind a support pillar, just as blue plasma bolts tore through the hallway. Imperial guards shouted in confusion. Shadowed figures emerged from hidden ceiling panels, their armor bending light around them like moving ghosts. Assassins. The first attacker lunged toward the Emperor. Elias drew his railgun. The weapon thundered once, shattering the silence. The assassin's chest erupted backward into the wall. Another attacker descended with twin plasma blades. Elias intercepted the strike barehanded, twisting the assassin's wrist before driving his combat knife through the figure's throat. The corridor became chaos. Gunfire flashed through darkness. Bodies drifted weightlessly in failing gravity. One assassin broke past the guards and charged directly for Kaelor. Elias stepped between them. The plasma blade pierced deep into his shoulder armor. He ignored the wound completely. Instead, he seized the attacker by the helmet and fired the railgun point-blank into their face. The remaining assassins fell seconds later. Emergency lights finally returned. Bodies floated silently through the ruined corridor while surviving guards stared at Elias in horror. A security commander knelt beside one of the dead attackers. Ghost blades, he whispered. Imperial intelligence operatives, which meant the attack had come from inside the Empire itself. Kaelor looked toward Elias, blood running down the human's scorched armor. How many? Elias scanned the bodies once. 8 attackers, he answered. Then his eyes shifted toward the distant Senate towers visible through the palace windows. But there were 11 conspirators. The human who survived the Black Frontier. 3 years before he became emperor, Kaelor believed loyalty could be inherited. As crown prince of the Varexian Empire, he had been raised among nobles who spoke endlessly about honor, bloodlines, and duty. Every advisor around him insisted the empire's strength came from tradition and carefully maintained hierarchy. Then the Black Frontier taught him otherwise. The diplomatic convoy entered the frontier under military escort, gliding through dead systems beyond imperial territory. Ancient asteroid fields drifted around abandoned stations while damaged satellites floated endlessly through darkness. The region was lawless, controlled by pirates, mercenaries, and scavenger clans that preyed on weaker vessels. Kaelor stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying the void outside. This mission was a mistake, one advisor muttered nervously. Kaelor ignored him. The frontier negotiations were necessary. Several mining colonies near imperial borders had stopped paying tribute, and rumors of rebellion spread through nearby systems. Peace had to be restored before conflict expanded. At least, that was the official purpose of the mission. The betrayal came 12 hours later. Warning sirens screamed across the flagship as explosions ripped through the escort formation. Kaelor watched in shock as 2 imperial cruisers suddenly opened fire on their own fleet. Traitors, someone shouted. The bridge dissolved into panic. Enemy ships emerged from the asteroid field. Pirate destroyers, mercenary carriers, and stolen military vessels armed with illegal plasma weapons. Kaelor's royal guards immediately demanded evacuation. Then another explosion tore through the ship. The command deck lost power. Smoke filled the air as shattered consoles sparked violently around them. Your Highness, we must retreat now. But retreat became impossible when boarding alarms activated across the vessel. The attackers were already inside. Kaelor expected his elite guards to restore order. Instead, confusion spread through the ship. Officers argued over protocols while soldiers waited for commands from dead superiors. Every layer of imperial hierarchy collapsed under pressure. Only one person moved without hesitation. Elias Ward. At the time, he was nothing more than a contracted human security officer assigned to cargo protection. Kaelor barely remembered approving the employment request months earlier. Yet while trained officers panicked, the human reacted instantly. Seal Corridor 6, Elias ordered. Shut down non-essential gravity. Move wounded toward engineering. A commander stared at him angrily. You don't give orders here. Elias grabbed the officer by the armor and shoved him against a damaged console. then keep waiting to die. The human released him and moved immediately toward the armory. For a moment, nobody followed. Then another explosion rocked the deck, and frightened soldiers rushed after Elias because he was the only one acting like survival was still possible. Kaelor followed as well. The next several days became a nightmare. The convoy was destroyed piece by piece while survivors escaped into abandoned mining stations hidden throughout the asteroid belt. Supplies ran low. Radiation leaks poisoned entire sections of the station. Exhausted soldiers collapsed from fear and lack of sleep. Elias never stopped moving. He sealed hull breaches himself when drones failed. He carried injured aliens twice his size through collapsing corridors. When food supplies ran out, he spent 14 straight hours repairing broken purification systems so the survivors would have water. Kaelor watched the human closely during those desperate days. Elias rarely spoke about fear, rarely complained. He simply adapted to each new disaster as though hardship were normal. One night, while distant gunfire echoed through the station tunnels, Kaelor finally asked the question that had haunted him. "How are you still functioning?" Elias glanced up from cleaning blood off his combat knife. "Functioning? You haven't slept in nearly 3 days." The human shrugged slightly. "Not the worst week I've had." Kaelor stared at him in disbelief. Most Phyrexians required strict recovery cycles after prolonged stress. Even trained soldiers broke mentally under exhaustion. Yet the human kept going. "Why?" Kaelor asked quietly. "Why fight this hard when survival is unlikely?" Elias slid fresh ammunition into his pistol. "Because giving up never kept our species alive before." The answer stayed with Kaelor. Humans came from a violent world filled with predators, disease, war, and unstable climates. Survival had shaped them differently from most galactic civilizations. They endured first, complained later. The final battle came aboard an abandoned refinery station near the edge of the frontier. Pirate forces surrounded the survivors inside the reactor core while fire spread through the lower decks. Escape ships were minutes away from destruction. Kaelor's remaining guards urged surrender. Elias disagreed. "We hold the corridor," he said simply. "There are too many of them," an officer argued. "Probably." The officer stared at him. "You're insane." "Maybe." Then Elias handed Kaelor a stolen access card. "There's a maintenance route to the hangar below this deck. Take whoever's left and run." Kaelor frowned. "What about you?" The human checked the ammunition counter on his railgun. "I'll slow them down." Before Kaelor could object, Elias sealed the blast doors between them. Then the gunfire started. The sounds lasted nearly 3 hours. Explosions shook the station repeatedly, while pirate forces tried forcing their way through the reactor corridor. Eventually, the firing stopped completely. Kaelor believed the human was dead. Then, moments before the evacuation ships launched, the blast doors reopened. Elias staggered into the hangar covered in blood and ash, carrying the severed insignia plate of the pirate commander in one hand. Behind him, the reactor tunnels burned. Nobody asked how he survived. Even then, they were afraid to know. And from that moment forward, Kaelor never trusted another man more than the human who walked willingly into hell and returned alive. The court's greatest fear, the imperial capital, no longer felt stable. Warships crowded the skies above the planet, their engines glowing like distant stars beyond the palace windows. Across the city, news networks broadcast endless debates about the failed assassination attempt while noble houses blamed one another behind closed doors. And everywhere, the same rumors spread through the empire. The human had become too powerful. Captain Elias Ward moved through the lower levels of the palace in silence, ignoring the nervous glances from guards and servants alike. Since the attack in the throne corridor, security had tightened across the capital, but Elias trusted none of it. Too many uniforms, too many hidden loyalties, too many frightened politicians pretending control still existed. He stepped into a crowded transport sector beneath the palace, where workers repaired damaged energy conduits from the recent sabotage. Alien laborers stopped briefly when they recognized him. Not with fear, with respect. That disturbed the nobles far more than violence ever could. You actually came, an elderly mechanic said, surprised. Elias crouched beside the damaged conduit. You requested military shielding plates. Nobody delivered them. The mechanic snorted bitterly. Senators said workers aren't priority assets. Elias grabbed a toolkit from the floor. They're wrong. Without ceremony, he joined a repair crews. The surrounding workers exchanged uncertain looks before continuing their tasks beside him. That was the problem. Humans ignored hierarchy. Within the empire, rank determined worth. Nobles ruled. Workers obeyed. Artificial beings served without rights. Military officers followed rigid command structures that rarely changed regardless of circumstance. Humans disrupted everything. They spoke to soldiers and laborers the same way. They adapted too quickly. And worst of all, people followed them willingly. High above the transport sector, Lord Vethrin watched security footage with growing disgust. He poisons the social order simply by existing, the noble muttered. Several senators stood beside him within a hidden council chamber. One senator lowered his voice nervously. Support for the Emperor is increasing among military labor divisions. Because of the human, another hissed. Vethrin turned toward the holographic display, showing Elias working alongside common laborers. 4 generations, the Empire survived because every species understood its place, he said coldly. Humans infect that structure with dangerous ideas. Merit, equality, individual freedom. Concepts the Empire considered destabilizing. Vethrin shut off the display. The Emperor must fall before humanity spreads further into the core systems. Meanwhile, Elias uncovered the truth entirely by accident. While inspecting damaged security networks beneath the palace, he discovered encrypted transmissions hidden inside maintenance relays. Most intelligence officers would have overlooked them because the signals appeared fragmented and incomplete. But humans recognized patterns differently. Elias followed the transmission routes deep below the Imperial District until they led him into ancient underground chambers buried beneath the capital itself. The place predated the Empire. Massive black walls surrounded a colossal machine dormant beneath layers of dust and forgotten technology. Ancient reactor lines stretched through the darkness like veins beneath the planet. An old planetary defense core. Elias stared at the machine grimly as corrupted data flickered across nearby terminals. The weapon was powerful enough to destroy the entire capital. Maybe more. Footsteps echoed behind him. Emperor Kaelor entered the chamber with several loyal guards, his expression darkening immediately. You found it, he said quietly. Elias nodded once. Your nobles hid a planet killer beneath the throne. Kaelor approached the ancient reactor slowly. It was built during the founding wars. Officially, it was dismantled centuries ago. It wasn't. The Emperor looked toward the inactive machine. What do they plan? Elias activated the recovered transmission logs. A holographic recording filled the chamber. Vethrin's voice echoed through the darkness. The Emperor dies during the Ascension ceremony. The human is blamed. The Empire unites through war. The recording ended. Silence settled heavily across the chamber. Kaelor closed his eyes briefly. Civil war. No, Elias replied coldly. Extermination. The Emperor studied him carefully. You already knew they feared humans. They don't fear humans because we're violent. Kaelor waited. Elias looked toward the reactor core. They fear us because their system can't survive people who refuse to stay beneath them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Kaelor surprised him. If surrendering you ended this peacefully, the Emperor said quietly, would you do it? Elias answered immediately. Yes. Kaelor frowned. You'd let them execute you? If it saves billions. The Emperor looked away bitterly. That's exactly why they fear you. Before Elias could respond, alarms suddenly screamed throughout the underground complex. Emergency lights flashed red. A palace officer's voice burst through comm channels. Your Majesty, rebel forces are attacking the Imperial Ascension ceremony. Senate towers are under bombardment. The chamber trembled violently as distant explosions shook the city above. Kaelor's expression hardened instantly. So it begins. Orbital impacts thundered across the capital, while the palace descended into chaos. Loyal guards exchanged fire with rebel soldiers in burning corridors as warships battled overhead. Elias checked his railgun. How long until the defense core activates? A terrified technician answered through comms. 8 minutes. Kaelor looked toward the ancient machine beneath the planet. If activated, the weapon would kill millions instantly. Elias turned toward the tunnel leading deeper underground. I'll stop it. The Emperor stepped beside him. No, Kaelor said firmly. We stop it. And above them, the Empire began to burn. Humanity is the reason the Empire survives. The imperial capital burned beneath a sky filled with war. From the shattered palace towers, Emperor Kaelor watched rebel warships exchange plasma fire with loyalist fleets high above the atmosphere. Explosions lit the clouds in violent flashes while debris rained across the city below. The Empire was collapsing in real time. Inside the palace, alarms screamed endlessly through smoke-filled corridors as civilians and wounded soldiers fled toward underground shelters. Entire sections of the government district had already fallen to rebel forces loyal to Lord Vethrin. And beneath all of it, hidden in the ancient foundations of the planet, the Defense Corps continued counting down toward activation. 6 minutes remained. Elias Ward moved quickly through the descending reactor tunnels beside the Emperor and a handful of surviving loyalists. Emergency lights flickered weakly along ancient steel walls scarred by centuries of neglect. Radiation warnings flashed everywhere. One of the alien soldiers slowed, breathing heavily through his mask. These levels are lethal, he warned. They'll get worse, Elias replied. Kaelor glanced toward him. How far to the core? 2 kilometers. The synthetic intelligence unit accompanying them projected a holographic route through the tunnel system. Primary access corridors are blocked, it reported. Rebel forces have sealed most entrances. Then we improvise, Elias said immediately. The machine tilted its head slightly. Improvisation increases operational risk. Standing still increases it more. They continued deeper underground while distant tremors shook dust from the ceiling overhead. Somewhere above them, the civil war intensified. The deeper they descended, the more the environment changed. The tunnels became ancient and enormous, built long before modern imperial architecture. Massive reactor pipes lined the walls like the bones of some buried mechanical beast. Heat radiated from the planet's core systems, turning the air heavy and oppressive. Then the shooting started. Rebel soldiers emerged from hidden barricades ahead, plasma fire erupting through the narrow corridor. The loyalist soldiers immediately took cover. Elias did not. He surged forward through the gunfire with terrifying speed, railgun thundering in the confined tunnel. The first rebel collapsed instantly. Elias grabbed the second attacker and slammed them against the reactor wall hard enough to crack armor plating. Kaelor watched silently as the human kept moving despite plasma burns striking his shoulder and side. Pain slowed him, but it never stopped him. That realization settled heavily inside the Emperor. The nobles had always misunderstood humanity. Humans were not dangerous because they enjoyed violence. They were dangerous because suffering did not break them easily. The team finally reached the final blast doors protecting the reactor chamber. Only 3 minutes remained. The synthetic intelligence unit interfaced with the ancient controls while Elias guarded the corridor behind them. Then a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. You see now what your weakness has cost us. Lord Vethrin emerged from the shadows, surrounded by armed soldiers. His silver, ceremonial armor gleamed beneath the reactor lights, while the unstable energy core pulsed behind him like a dying star. Kaelor stepped forward angrily. You would destroy the capital to preserve your power? To preserve order, Vethrin corrected coldly. The Empire survived for centuries because every species understood its place. His eyes shifted toward Elias with open hatred. Then you placed a human beside the throne. Elias kept his weapon raised, but remained silent. Vethrin continued. Humans spread rebellion everywhere they go. Workers begin questioning nobles. Soldiers abandon obedience for loyalty. Even machines respond better to them than their rightful masters. Kaelor looked toward the burning reactor. No, the Emperor said quietly. They simply remind people they deserve more than chains. Vethren's expression twisted with fury. You betrayed tradition. Kaelor's voice hardened. I betrayed at the moment I realized tradition was killing us. The rebels opened fire. The reactor chamber exploded into chaos. Plasma bolts scorched across metal walls while the unstable core roared louder with each passing second. Elias moved directly into the enemy formation, fighting with brutal efficiency inside the confined space. One rebel aimed toward Kaelor. Elias intercepted the shot. The plasma round tore through his side armor. Still he kept fighting. Vethren drew an energy blade and charged the Emperor personally, but Elias stepped between them despite blood pouring from multiple wounds. Their clash shook the chamber. Vethren fought with elegant precision, refined through aristocratic combat training. Elias fought like survival itself. Relentless, violent, unstoppable. The human finally disarmed Vethren and drove him backward against the reactor controls. You were supposed to stay beneath us, Vethren snarled weakly. Elias stared at him coldly. Humans never learned how. He slammed Vethren into the reactor console as the countdown reached its final seconds. The synthetic intelligence unit shouted urgently. Manual shutdown required. Without hesitation, Elias staggered toward the overheating core chamber. Radiation alarms screamed immediately. Elias, Kaelor began. The human looked back only once. Keep the Empire alive. Then he entered the reactor. The chamber flooded with blinding light as Elias forced the ancient system into emergency shutdown manually. Energy surged violently through the underground complex. For one terrible moment, Kaelor believed the planet would still die. Then the reactor went silent. Across the capital, rebel fleets powered down as news of Vethren's failure spread through surviving command networks. The coup collapsed within hours. Days later, the imperial court gathered once more inside the damaged Hall of Ascension. This time, the throne stood alone. Beside it rested a scorched human railgun mounted permanently upon black steel. Emperor Kaelor faced the silent nobles before him. The galaxy feared humanity because humans endure what empires cannot, he said. His gaze swept across the chamber. And that is precisely why I kept one at my side.